Cool. So thanks for coming out, everybody. I'm going to be talking today about building modern, scalable web apps with a framework called NestJS. It's a newer framework that's kind of emerged onto the scene, and it has a lot of productivity benefits, which we're going to just dive into and talk about today. So, my name is Jesse Carter. I build cool stuff here at Vehicle on GitHub. If you're going to try to follow me anywhere, probably best just to GitHub, because I don't say anything worthwhile on Twitter or any of those platforms. So. I'm also really interested right now in microservice architectures, Kubernetes, infrastructure as code. So if you think this talk sucked, you're dead to me. But in all seriousness, if any of those other topics interested you, feel free to come and talk to me about that after too. All right. So what to expect? I'm going to try to stay light on the slides, and I'm going to try to do some live code just to kind of help solidify some of the concepts that I think kind of make Nest a really approachable and really cool framework. So we're definitely going to be talking about Nest. We're going to talk about some meta programming a little bit, and kind of how that ties into the broader ecosystem around NestJS and how that helps you to write clean code. And yeah, clean testable code. That's kind of the biggest takeaway, I think. Cool. So NestJS, this is directly from their GitHub, but they advertise themselves as being a progressive Node.js framework for building efficient, scalable, and enterprise-grade server-side apps, and using modern TypeScript and JavaScript functionality. So this is an interesting chart. This just kind of shows sort of the kind of rapid trajectory of growth that NestJS has been seeing in the community. You know, it's the newest one on the scene, but it's been a pretty meteoric rise to 13,000 started. This is actually a good update. I think it's actually around 13,600. It's one of the fastest growing Node frameworks, period, in the entire ecosystem. So people are definitely very excited about it. I mean, seeing more and more projects coming up and activity on GitHub and in the various communication channels that they support right now. Okay, so to understand, I think, why Nest is resonating with so many people, I think it's valuable to take a look at kind of the history of what server-side web application development looked like inside of the Node ecosystem. So how many people find this to look somewhat familiar and know something about Express? Awesome. So Express has definitely been sort of the de facto library, I guess, for building web applications in Node.js. And one of the things that I think drew me to it originally and really captured a lot of people's interest was just how approachable the syntax is. Like it's pretty straightforward here. We have a route param, and we have some function that's attached to it that'll do something for us. So this is kind of the bare minimum, 7 lines of code. Here's your Hello World Express application. And that makes it a really, really fantastic tool for being able to do rapid prototyping, just kind of getting your feet wet with web app development. But what I think is missing from this example is a lot of the maturity that frameworks like Laravel or Spring or there's examples from pretty much any language that you would want to take when it comes to how does this scale to be an actual full-featured production-ready application. Because there's a lot of stuff that we're not really capturing here. We haven't found a nice way to kind of address cross-cutting concerns for things like authentication, caching, database access, and on top of all of that, kind of how we structure our code so that it's actually easy to write tests against it and to prove that it does what it's supposed to do. So that's really where Nest kind of fills a gap in need, I think, in the ecosystem. So again, from their marketing material, Nest provides an out-of-the-box application architecture which allows for effortless creation of highly testable, scalable, loosely coupled, easily maintainable applications. So I'm going to pause here for a second and just kind of show you how easy it is to quickly get up and running with an NestJS application, and then we'll dive back into kind of talking about how it achieves some of the stuff that it actually does. So I do want to point out that just kind of around that, enterprise-y kind of batteries included approach to development, NestJS comes with a command line interface, which you can use to do a lot of the kind of common scaffolding activities that we all love to do when we're writing web apps, like making controllers, spinning up new applications and things like that. So you can install this with at NestJS/CLI from NPM. I just haven't installed it locally, so it's actually So if you want to get started with a brand new Nest application, assuming you have that command line utility installed, we can just go nest new line app. Oh, that looks ugly, but that's fine. And just pick which package manager you want to use. And you can see here there's going to be a summary of the stuff that I'm going to get out of the box when I do this. So let's do that. So let's see what we got. Okay. So there's not a huge amount of source code in here. I'm just going to draw attention to a couple of kind of key files just at the start to kind of get a feel for where the application entry point is and just how to think about organization inside of a Nest application. So the most important one here is our application module file. Is that okay for font size? People in the back? I can go a little bit bigger.
Could you make it bigger, please?
Yeah, sure. That's good. Better? So you'll see here that we just have a simple class called app module, and then there's some fancy decorator stuff going on here. And we're going to talk about that in a second because I think that there's a lot of value in at least understanding to some degree when you're dealing with frameworks like this, kind of how the magic is achieved, because it can inform a lot of your decisions around how you write your code and things like that. So let's just kind of treat these as magical for a moment, and then I'll hopefully show kind of how that works and give you a lot more confidence in understanding what's happening under the hood. So Nest ships with a modular architecture to the point where they actually have a concept of a module, which is a package of related functionality. And if anyone's written Angular before, has anyone written Angular? Does this look familiar to anybody in terms of my module decorator here? Nest is heavily influenced by Angular and the dependency injection system that Angular is kind of pioneered on that front. So yeah. So you'll see here that I'm specifying, or the boilerplate that I use is specifying some information about some controllers and some providers. And controllers in the context of our HTTP-based web application are the pieces of functionality that expose handlers, just like we saw in the Express example. So in this case, you can see I have a class called controller, app controller, and I have just one method in that class, and it's being decorated again. We'll again jump into this. It's being decorated with a HTTP verb, which basically indicates that this method should be used whenever a GET request comes into the application. And it's going to return the result of an app service get low. So let's just see if it works.
Wow, hello world.
So that's kind of an example of what comes out of the box. I do want to point out here that Nest very much focuses on a separation between your controllers as they function for basically routing. That's their job, is to just route requests around, versus I guess business logic, which would relate to accessing information from the database or performing operations against your backend. So to that end, we also have the concept of services, which is a typical place where business logic might live. And hopefully this concept of kind of like dumb, flat, small controllers and kind of your business logic living somewhere else is something that's kind of familiar regardless of what language or framework experience you have. So if we take a look at the app service, it's pretty predictable here. It just has a get hello method, which we call from our controller, which returns whatever we want it to return. And I just want to point out that out of the box, you have a live reload server and all kinds of scripts available to you to be able to do common tasks, such as building a production set of artifacts if you wanted to deploy this application, doing code formatting, running the app, both with Nodebond for live reload or just regularly, and then a bunch of test utilities and stuff that all come out of the box It's just a result of running that CLI command. So there's a lot to kind of set you off on the right path, just right off the start, towards kind of a clean, testable modular architecture. And I'll just quickly also show, we'll come back to these in a little bit, but again, strong focus on testability. That's really at the root of why Nest is built in the way that it is to be able to empower you to feel confident about the code that you're writing. So you can see here in the tests that also came scaffolded with the application, I have both tests around specific controller functionality. So this is setting up a test module that'll have access to the same app controller and app service that we saw in the actual running application. And we can obviously write expectations around what should come back from invoking methods directly on those objects. But on top of that, so I would consider this to be more of a unit test, where we're essentially testing the functionality of the app controller and its relationship to the service. But on top of that, Nest also ships with this concept of kind of more of an end-to-end test, where we're actually mocking the HTTP server interaction, so treating it more from the perspective of how a client application would actually interact with the backend. So you can see in the app end-to-end spec, we're actually doing an expectation around getting reference to the actual HTTP server, issuing a GET request against a particular route inside of that server, and then expecting the result. And this is using a thing called supertest, which is a common HTTP library. Yeah?
Is there a way to nest the test?
Yeah, so Jest, which is the out-of-the-box testing library, supports arbitrary nesting of describe and it blocks. So if I wanted to do nesting here, I could just create another describe block, like nested describe. It could have its all of its own lifecycle hook methods for like the for each, after each, and you can have as many hits nested inside of it, and you can keep nesting describes like that as much as you want to. Cool.
So you have a test, it's in a separate file from the main application, or you can mix them?
You can mix them. I mean, the scripts that come out of the box have some kind of expectation around where things will live. If you look at like the just E2E, I think this will grab e2e.spec files anywhere in the application structure. But the way that the scaffolding tool kind of has the distinction, so you'll notice that they are mixed already. The unit test, the spec for the controller, lives right next to as a sibling to the thing it's testing, whereas the end-to-end tests, which are kind of testing from the perspective of the user application, live in this test folder. And that's just kind of like a convention that they provide for you out of the box. So you could definitely modify that if that doesn't kind of jive with how you really organize things. Yeah?
So if we want to do selective testing, is there like an out-of-the-box toolkit for it?
Like running only specific tests?
Like selective testing, like I want to test this module specifically, I don't want to test the rest of this.
Yeah, absolutely. Jest just does that in general. So, I mean, I don't have a lot of testing here, but you can just pass like a file glob and it'll match on like the path. So if I wanted to only test like controller, I could just type the word like yarn test controller and it's going to match on everything that has controller in it. So you can set up like really kind of granular sets of suites for testing just by like having nice file globs like that. And you can see I already actually broke my test because it was expecting that the app controller, when invoked, would return a particular string, and it's obviously returning a different string now that I've changed that code. So that's kind of a brief, I guess, introduction to some of the stuff that comes out of the box. And I did want to take an opportunity to kind of talk about decorators and what they do and how they're being used here, because it's a kind of a newer concept. Does anyone feel familiar with decorators? Is that something that's kind of new? Or? Yeah.
It's new.
All right, let's do that. So I'm a big proponent of kind of getting your hands dirty with code as soon as possible in the process, especially as you're evaluating new technology. It's great to read through docs and everything like that, but you really kind of expose what a tool is good for or what flaws or gaps it might have by just writing code as soon as possible. So This isn't necessarily related to Nest, but I just wanted to show, since we're talking in the context of TypeScript here, how quick and easy it can be to just start kind of rapid prototyping with some TypeScript code. So I'm just going to create a new TypeScript project in this directory. And I'm going to yarn init it so that we can bring in some packages. And I'm only going to add one package here for the moment. It's a package called reflect metadata. Okay, so I'm just going to go back to my slides for 1 second. This is something I wanted to talk about in regards to a concept called metaprogramming. So I found this on the internet. But metaprogramming refers to a variety of ways that a program has knowledge of itself or can manipulate itself. And this is kind of at the core of what Nest is doing when it basically takes those decorators and kind of compiles your application into something that actually runs. So I wanted to show kind of some examples of how that happens in practice. The topic I wanted to start with first is reflection, which is kind of one of the aspects of metaprogramming that's available to you, and that's more focused on the ability to introspect your application, to find pieces of code that meet certain criteria, kind of like, the ability to query your program itself. There's different kind of aspects to metaprogramming, but this is the one we're going to focus on the most for this. So out of the box, JavaScript actually does have some basic primitive support for reflection, and that's in the form of this reflectable object. There is a specification that's in the works for kind of some more advanced functionality around reflection. But in the meantime, while they sort that out, that's what the reflect metadata package provides for us. Basically a shim to the proposal for what that functionality would be like. And an enormous amount of community effort and kind of velocity has been built around these features. Angular at its core uses this, Nest uses this. There's a lot of packages and utilities that are building around this, so I wouldn't be too worried personally about kind of adopting this stuff at this point. So let's start with some basic examples here. So I'm just going to start with a class. And one of the main functionalities of the reflection API is the ability to attach arbitrary information to code constructs. So often we'll attach those to classes. The reason is that classes have a constructor function, which make them very easy to look up based on that constructor function. It's really common to pass those things around as parameters and things like that. So, for example, I could check to see right off the bat if the sum class has any metadata attached to it. And the way that I would do that to start, kind of bouncing back to the idea of getting your hands dirty as soon as possible. One tool that I really, really enjoy, and it's an extension that I've installed in VS Code, is something called Quokka. Start on current file. And Quokka is an interactive code runner. So basically, as I make changes to this code, it continuously runs that code, and we can use that as a way with console logging and some other shortcuts to basically get immediate feedback and to basically see how, as we make changes to our code, it'll affect the output or behavior of that code. So right now, I've got nothing. If I had some variable, for example, sum equals 2, and I log that, whoops. You'll see that Quokka is inlining the results both directly beside where I wrote the console log, as well as I'll get the console output at the bottom. So I just want to focus on that as a tool for kind of like learning about how decorators work. This is actually how I kind of like, I had a desire to understand what this was doing under the hood. So this is one tool that I use for kind of like spelunking, as it were. Let's get this out of here. Cool. So let's check to see if there's any metadata that's been attached to the sum class. So there's a variety of methods here. Because we're using TypeScript, we get some pretty awesome IntelliSense and information about what parameters are expected to use these methods. So let's start with get metadata keys. So this function gets the metadata keys defined on the target object. So if we were to check an object, we could check a target. So I pass in the actual class constructor to this function. And another shortcut that Quokka has is this special comment notation, which also causes it to basically do a console dump of like whatever the result of this expression is. Sorry, one second. So as you might have expected, there's nothing in there at the moment because I've just defined this class, and there's obviously no libraries that are modifying it or doing anything to it. So if I wanted to attach metadata, we would use a different reflect method. And I could say then define some metadata. So metadata takes a key, which is basically like a lookup value that you can use to retrieve that metadata later. That key can do whatever you want. Obviously, it can be beneficial to use more specific strings to avoid collisions with potential other libraries. Or even better, you can use the new JavaScript symbols, which are guaranteed to be unique, so there can't be collisions across libraries that may or may not be adding metadata to your objects. So let's add some key. And then the next value here is the metadata value. So this is the actual information that I want to store attached to my class here. So let's import 2. And then it needs a target, the thing that's actually going to attach that metadata to. So in this case, attach some class. And you can immediately see that because I have Quokka running here, I'm now getting back some values for the metadata keys that are attached to some class. And if I wanted to get the value behind that, get metadata, get metadata, what did I call it? Some key. And then the target, what am I retrieving from some class? Obviously, I'm just giving the object back out. So that's kind of some of the core functionality around reflection. That's in JavaScript. It's actually one of the techniques that's heavily utilized is the storage of metadata on your objects inside of your Nest application. So that's kind of an introduction to that. The other kind of piece of the puzzle is the decorators themselves, and these things do tie together. So let's do that. Make a new file with decorators.
So is the class itself have access to these metadata that are being attached to it?
The class itself, as long as it has, like if it kept an internal reference to its own constructor, or you could reference through the instance prototype constructor, you could grab it that way. So in order to use decorators, there's an actual option that I got to use here in the Typescript configuration for the compiler. So I do have to turn on the decorator functionality, otherwise I'm going to get some warnings for that. To stop Quokka for a second because it doesn't like to pick up those changes. Let's go back to decorators. Let's do this. So a decorator is really nothing but a function that will be executed with some information about the actual code construct that's decorating. So we could start with like the most basic thing where we basically just have a function. And this is another kind of technique that I like to use if I don't know kind of what to expect from an API, especially if you're doing some interactive code like this, is to just generically spread the arguments that the function will receive. So then you can print them out or whatever kind of expected. So this is an array of anything. And let's just make this function log those arguments. Okay, so again, this is just a function. So if I were to invoke this function, oh, I didn't start clocking now. You can see that interactively I receive information about the values that I'm explicitly passing to the function itself. But that's obviously not the point of decorators. I just wanted to illustrate that they really are nothing but functions at their core. What's interesting is when we apply those decorators to actual code constructs. So if I were to decorate this class, I actually get a different value here. And in this case, it's an actual reference to the constructor function itself. And that's what you get when you decorate a class. if I were to decorate a method, actually doesn't do any body, doesn't matter. I'll kill this one here. I get something else back here. So when I decorate a class method, I still get a reference to the class constructor of the class that owns the method being decorated, and that's the first parameter. You'll see that there's 3 different parameters that I receive on a method-based decorator. So those are the class constructor, the actual string-based name of the method that's being decorated. So if this changes, obviously the string here that I get back at parameter 2 is going to change. And then finally, I get some information about the actual, the function itself that's being represented here. So one thing that you can do with decorators that I'm not going to cover right now is actually overwrite the functionality of the function that's being decorated. So because I have a handle to this value, I could make it do stuff before or after it's invoked, or I could completely overwrite its implementation entirely. But the focus for this is going to be more around how decorators relate back to what we just saw in the previous example about reflection, because that's a very common use case. So, oh, yeah, I should cover this too. Another concept that's kind of important in definitely in this support is this concept of decorator factories, where we can take in something and return a function that will then get the rest of the args and do something else. And that changes the way that decorators are invoked. You can see that the first decorator is just passing like the function name, and it doesn't have any parentheses at the end of it. Whereas with decorator factories, you would actually have to invoke those because they're returning a function that gives you back another function, and then you expect to get some value in there. So that's another common pattern. Okay, let's go to this one. And let's create a new decorator, injectable. And this is a really common decorator from Nest. We look at the app service, for example. You'll see that anything that you want to be able to participate in dependency injection will have this decorator on top of it, injectable. Now, the whole point of dependency injection, where this kind of ties in, is that in a typical web application or in kind of any software development that you're kind of participating in, it's really common for code to depend on other code. And you kind of have 2 options when you have dependency between code. You can explicitly provide that dependency by passing it yourself, or you can use a technique like dependency injection to allow something else in your code to kind of take your glue between those things and to wire those dependencies together. So this doesn't really make sense without having a dependency, so I'm just going to create a class called dependency. And I'm going to express the relationship between these 2 classes by saying that the constructor for this class is going to expect to receive a dependency. And for anyone who's used Framework before that uses dependency injection, this is one of the most common ways that you get your dependencies is just through the constructors of your classes. Again, going back to the Nest example, this is analogous to the app controller. In an effort to make sure that the controller code is lean and doesn't have business logic in it, it receives as a dependency the app service, so that the app service could be the thing that actually implements the business logic. So let's do that, and let's put that That's good. I'm just going to switch the block of context so that we look at this one again. Actually, this ties into one other setting from the TS config at the bottom here. So this is where the magic really happens. If you're kind of interested in how all this stuff works together. And that is this TypeScript option to omit decorator metadata. And what this does is, because TypeScript analyzes your code in order to transpile it to the JavaScript that it eventually outputs, it can, as part of that compilation process, have information about the various classes or interfaces or things that don't really exist anymore once you're in JavaScript land, because there's not that same kind of concept of strong typing. So when I turn on this omit decorator metadata, here. And you'll recall that when I first wrote this, I defined some metadata on some class. I passed it myself, this sum key prop 42. But you'll notice here that when I print out the metadata keys that are now that are available on some class, there's a new one. It just popped up, and it only just popped up because I turned on that option. And that's a special metadata key called design param types. And what that gives you is the actual types of the values that the constructor requires in order to create an instance of that class. So if we were to grab design param types, you'll see here that I get an array. So I'm applying this to some class. And so what it's giving me back is an actual array of the types that this class would need in order to be instantiated properly. So if I change the things that it takes in, you'll see that that changes. So I can basically have runtime access to type information that prior to TypeScript I would never have been able to leverage to make decisions about my code. And if I were to quickly spit out some actual JavaScript here, let's put this in the build. Thank you, thank you. I have my settings too strict right now. There. Here we go. Sorry, this is what I was looking for. You can see in the outputted JavaScript, it's actually, like I said, keeping a track of the things that that class would need to be constructed. So this is an actual function reference to the constructor class of that other function, and we can use that at runtime to look up an instance of that from something like a dependency injection container. So that was kind of, I guess, a brief intro to those two concepts, and basically going back and looking at the Nest code, I feel personally after kind of learning about that stuff, like it makes a lot more sense what's actually happening here and how some of this stuff happens. Because previous to these techniques, something like this where my controller has this thing that it's supposed to get, and I'm not going to be the one instantiating it and handing it to the controller. It needs to come from somewhere. And so that's kind of at the core of what Nest does. It basically provides you a way to glue dependencies between all your code and invert that control.
I have a question.
Yeah.
That option that you said with TypeScript configuration metadata, is that TypeScript specific, or it's become available only if you use Nest?
This is TypeScript specific. It's a technique that's used by Nest, but also by Angular. Like Angular uses like syntax that looks almost identical to this in terms of what the dependency injection mechanism looks like. So this is just, even if you're not writing Nest and you want to have runtime access to constructor parameters so that you can make decisions about those, you can also use it to get like return values of functions. Like if you want to know at runtime what output, what type of thing a function can produce, there's information that you can get from design return types. There's some special keys. There's 3 different keys that you can basically use. But it's definitely TypeScript specific because it's only possible because of the kind of the transpilation process where TypeScript has knowledge of your types and can write that information into the resulting JavaScript.
So that means it says it's experimental. That means there are still some issues that are not solved, or
it's marked experimental because the specification for decorators is still open as far as what it will look like when it reaches JavaScript. But because this has been so widely community adopted, if you just look at the partnership around Angular, that's Microsoft and Google building, a library that they support at the enterprise level, specifically with these 2 settings turned on. So I can certainly understand, if you read experimental and that makes you feel uncomfortable, that's a business decision you're going to have to kind of evaluate if you're thinking about using these technologies. But I personally don't see any issue with that at the moment.
So for me, it resonates with being a Microsoft TypeScript. It's a Microsoft product, yeah. So it resonates with C# reflection stuff.
Yeah.
That they and I understand the father of TypeScript is actually the inventor of C# and Delphi. All
Andrew
the
Selberg.
yeah.
I got to meet him at Build 2 years ago. It was awesome.
And so the decorators is no, the dependency injection. I'm sorry, it's part of solid object-oriented programming thing.
Version.
So actually the general principle is that the code should not depend on an instance or an object, but should depend on the class, or the interface, how it is.
And JavaScript is unique in that it doesn't rely on or need an actual language feature like interfaces to accomplish that, because it's so dynamic. The big thing is that with the dependency injection we're looking at, the class constructor function is just a token that we use to look up a value, and we can replace the value behind that token at any time. I'll show that in a second. So you can swap out the implementations.
But with the previous code, if you can go back, so where actually because it was very fast, so where you instantiate, let's say from the object-oriented point of view, where you instantiate the object and where you inject it in the, in the general definition of the.
So that's an implementation detail that Nest takes care of. As a developer working with the framework, you just express these dependencies with a normal kind of constructor signature. And behind the scenes, as long as the things that you're depending on are available at the module level. So you can see that I have at the application module level, I have a provider where I'm saying the app service is a dependency for the app and therefore should be available for dependency injection anywhere else that someone requires it. So in order to require it as a developer, all you have to do is wire it into your controller. That's it. And Nest takes care of instantiating it and also instantiating child dependencies. So if it depends on a class that itself has some sub-dependencies, it takes care of resolving that kind of in a waterfall way where it will build them all and provide those instances for you.
If I may, one more comment. But you have before a dependency or something, some code.
Yeah, that was
so that wasn't general expression of defining dependency, but where you have it. I don't know if it's.
Oh, this is the wrong one. This is something else. This is what you have. This guy.
You have somewhere a dependency. Oh yeah.
Yeah, it's just a class. I just made it up.
Oh, okay.
Just to illustrate that it's very common that a class will depend on needing to have an instance of another class in order to perform some business functionality.
Oh, okay.
You have a question?
Yeah, I was saying this looks almost identical to Angular.
Yes.
It's the same way. You don't find your services. You inject them into.
Yeah, that's right. The creator of Nest is very open about the fact that he was inspired by and kind of tried to mimic as much as possible the API for Angular and how it expresses its modules and it actually implements the dependency injection piece.
So do you use like certain classes from Angular?
That's an interesting question. I haven't experimented with that myself. They did just release Nest version 6, and it has an integration with the Angular console, which is like a GUI application for managing Angular applications. So there is enough commonality between the two that the Angular console can give you kind of like a GUI-based kind of like introspection into your code. I haven't played around with that yet. They literally just actually released version 6 2 or 3 days ago.
It's like, was it the React stuff that server-side rendering?
Yeah.
Would you be able to do the same thing with this?
You could definitely share like classes between the front and back end. I'm trying to think if there'd be like a situation where like a service dependency would actually make sense between, like if you're implementing business logic, if it actually makes sense for that to be used on both the front end and the back end. It's conceivable. I don't see any reason why not.
You can use it using NX workspaces. It's from a company called Marval.
Yes, yeah.
And with NX, you can, in one workspace, have the front-end projects, any common libraries that they use, as well as any other projects that you like, all managed to the NX CLI. And in doing that, since Nest is also TypeScript, so if you build common shared libraries that have the business logic in them, then you can share those between Angular and Nest. Nest is basically for backend.
Yeah.
Well, I'm assuming that the next version of Nest is probably going to have a server-side rendering for Angular. Right?
There is already community integration for server-side rendering for Angular, yeah. Yeah, and I think that there's opportunities to really have a really amazing integration between providing client-side dependencies, but like as part of the server-side rendering process, so that your components come preceded with all of the information or whatever that they need.
That's where React is kind of taking over.
Yeah, it's just works around.
So actually, Angular, what is using on the back end?
Pardon me?
Angular, what uses on the back end?
Angular is a client-side framework, so it's agnostic. You could consume any API, any REST-based API with Angular.
Okay.
Yeah, it doesn't have any kind of. I mean, certainly Nest is reaching the Angular community just because it's such a familiar syntax for people. So I think there's a lot of alignment there. But like, you can do Angular with any language on the back end. It speaks HTTP.
So Nest has nothing for the view part. Yeah.
Well, they do have MVC functionality. So if you're into building, you don't like single-page applications and you'd rather do like all of your view building and everything on the back end in a traditional MVC fashion, where you're building up a rendered page, it supports that already. It's one of the techniques that they have in there. Okay.
One more question.
Yeah, sure.
So, in terms of debugging, what are the tools that you
Sure. So out of the box, I believe that there is a debug configuration. If I jump into the package JSON. Start debug. Start debug. So I've got a breakpoint here in the code. That came from, I just ran the yarn start debug command, which is one of the scripts which is available whenever you use the CLI to generate an app. So yeah, live reloading, debugging, that's kind of like batteries included out of the box. The framework just...
like connect directly to reduce to the code?
Yeah, like I'm paused on breakpoint right now. App service.
So I don't need to define the debugger from the
Yeah, like it's using the standard no debug protocol. It picked it up automatically. There's a bunch of different ways you can set up debugging in Node in general, but it definitely strives to give you like an out-of-the-box solution that works for most cases. And you can definitely incorporate that with like a live reload so that it like can reattach the debugger as soon as there's code change that causes the app to reboot and stuff like that. Cool. Oh yes, back to slides. These are supposed to go. So, after learning a bit more about decorators and as an extension of that reflection, I sum up kind of this ability as they provide a mechanism to express the intent of code without having to necessarily specify the implementation details of that code. And what I mean by that, which is another really cool functionality of Nest, is if we look at the controller here, I have this method called getHello, and using a decorator, I've expressed some intent. The intent being that this method should be used whenever a GET request comes into the backend, right? But I didn't necessarily specify, if we look back at the example of the Express application, this is tied to implementation detail. Like I'm wiring up a specific function over here in the context of Express as a web server, whereas in this code, I've only expressed that this should be a handler for an HTTP request. I didn't say anything about the web server. It just so happens that NestJS uses Express under the hood as its web server. So ultimately, if we kind of, again, apply what we learned about decorators, this get thing is attaching some metadata to this class and this method that Nest can discover when it boots up to build my route table for me automatically. So under the hood, you know, we're getting back to something that probably looks a lot like this, only it built that route table for me instead of the other way around. But if we focus again on this concept of not specifying implementation detail, we can get to some really cool places. And Nest has actually done this at the web server level. So out of the box, it's using Express, but you can actually swap out Express entirely for another web server implementation called Fastify, which is another Node web server that's kind of more performance focused. And it, because we haven't specified any implementation details, can translate and act as a proxy between, you know, in the context of Express, I need to wire up the handlers like this. But if I'm using Fastify, they're still kind of, you know, going to be doing the same thing, but I'm going to wire them up this way. So if we jump over here, audience participation. So what do Laravel, Express, Play Framework, ASP.NET Core, NestJS, and Phoenix have in common? So you just take a stab at it. What's up? MVC, but more specific than that. Yeah. I would say that like the thing that's common between them is that they all operate using the HTTP protocol fundamentally. I mean, some of them offer like different stuff around WebSockets and everything like that. But fundamentally, if you're just looking at REST, which you pointed out, that's implemented using HTTP as a protocol. And HTTP as a protocol, if you kind of like step back and look at it at a very generic high level, it really boils down to a request and a response. And if we look at it like that, and I think that it's important to think about that like that sometimes because it allows you to transition between languages or frameworks more easily if you kind of understand that concept. But that's kind of really at the forefront and really at play here because Nest as a framework is able to completely swap out the thing that's actually doing the HTTP for us by allowing us to instead focus on expressing intent and not manually gluing together implementation.
Can you just go back to those languages that were up?
Sure. Thank you. I just honestly picked like the first 5 HTTP frameworks that I could.
How about React server side?
React server side isn't a web server. It can be implemented across many different web servers. Like you could do React server side rendering with Express or Fastify, or technically I think .NET Core even supports React server side rendering now. So it's not a web server itself. It's more of a mechanism for pre-building React components before they're sent to client. Yep.
Can Nest be combined with other programming languages like with Python or Ruby, so that like services is offered by that server, and just like an adapter translate that into.
Sorry, are you asking if Nest could communicate to another backend service written in a different language?
Yeah, instead of like using JavaScript like web service, just connect directly to like another web service like Django or whatever.
Yeah, I suppose like if we took the stuff with decorators, it'd be possible to treat Nest as a proxy to a different language entirely. I don't know if anyone's done that yet. I haven't seen anything like that from the community. Because it is written in JavaScript, it integrates best with JavaScript web servers like Express and Fastify. But I think that it's possible you could do something like
This
that.
would be possible. I'm just thinking that because this is very good for developing content.
Nest?
Yeah.
I would say it's very good for developing backend. It's very agnostic to front end. It's just a REST API web server.
If you would want to do that, because like .NET Core is already efficient, Laravel is already efficient. So yeah, you're going to use PHP, Laravel, use .NET.
Yeah. And I would say that like in any language, there's certain frameworks that kind of rise to kind of become the de facto ones. Like, you know, you're right, if you're going to be writing in PHP because that's where your skill set lies, chances are you're going to reach for Laravel because it makes you more productive as a developer. Same with JavaScript. And I think that kind of the core of all this is like, traditionally there hasn't been a framework in the Node community that really focused on developer productivity as it comes to like common tasks and code organization patterns. Like I've worked in a variety of Express-based applications, and the only commonality between them was the fact that they used Express. You know what I mean? Like the folder structures, the way that the code is organized, it's completely and utterly different between everyone. What's that?
I said that's what I didn't like about it.
You didn't like it?
No, not I didn't like it. I didn't like that about it. That it's kind of like too flexible.
Yes.
In the sense that you bring a new developer in, it's like,
Yeah.
it's all over the place. Whereas this will bring some type of structure.
Yeah, absolutely. It's very much focused on that kind of like, it's opinionated.
Yeah.
And that can be a very good thing sometimes. And Laravel has proven that, ASP.NET Core has proven that it's good to sometimes have some structure and less flexibility. One thing that I kind of glossed over when I generated the application was the rest of the functionality around the CLI. Is this the right? So I generated an app with the Nest CLI, but I can also generate most of the boilerplate components using the CLI as well. So if I was going to add, for example, a new controller to the application, there's a Nest. This is short for G is short for generate. But if I hit that, you can see that there's actually a whole bunch of different pre-baked kind of boilerplate reusable blocks, I guess, that kind of cover the common use cases. So like, if I wanted to create a new controller called like, they like cats, so I'll create one for cats. So you can see that that spit out a bunch of stuff for me. It created my cats controller, which is prefixed in the API route that was named cats. It spit out a test file to kind of force me to kind of keep testing at the forefront of what I'm doing, as well as it glued the cats controller into the controllers array, because Nest needs that to be there in order to discover all the routes that exist in the application.
Just like Angular.
Exactly, yeah. So yeah, very much this is all about developer productivity, you know, clean, reusable code that's easy to test. You can do apps, classes, config, controllers. There's a whole bunch of stuff that we haven't really talked too much about yet, like interceptors and filters and stuff. So I did want to show just one more thing before we kind of wrap it up, and it ties back to the idea of like getting your hands dirty with code as much as possible, a great thing to do. So if I grab the actual NestJS repo URL, and so obviously it could be a great idea to explore the code base of a framework that you're looking to evaluate or whatever. But Nest is really great at providing a ton of examples around different use cases that the framework supports. So you can see here that in the sample folder, I've got 23 different kind of examples of different things that Nest can do. I mean, we haven't, and I don't want to go into too much detail because I think it's better to just do this yourself and get your hands dirty, but because fundamentally Nest is really focused on the dependency management side of things and not necessarily on your web server, it actually works really, really well in a variety of other kind of extended use cases beyond just building a RESTful API. You can build, it has out-of-the-box support for building GraphQL servers, if you're into that. It has an out-of-the-box microservices module if you're concerned with having like a whole bunch of little services that talk to one another and don't necessarily expose a client-side API that will be consumed by like, a single-page application or whatever. You can do that. There's a whole bunch of different techniques around authentication, different database management techniques. I really like that it kind of gives you a really strong opinionated set of code structure, but doesn't necessarily tie you into an ecosystem of other technologies. If you want to use Mongo, it's really easy to use Mongo. If you want to use Postgres, it's easy to do that. And there is a growing ecosystem of community-based modules that kind of pull in and give you a Nest-first approach to integrating those technologies. So yeah, I wanted to.
Did you plan on touching on schematics?
Pardon me?
Did you plan on touching on schematics?
That's kind of what I covered with the Nest CLI here. These are the schematics that come out of the box with the Nest CLI.
Yeah, like as a concept.
I hadn't planned on going too in depth into it. Yeah, like it is actually based on Angular's schematics, so it's yeah, it all kind of plays into that same ecosystem. So it's doing some kind of boilerplate code generation as well as gluing in references to other places in your code as part of that generation process. So I just wanted to look at this one. Cats. So just at a really, really quick high level, let's look at some other Nest concepts. So besides controllers and services or providers, Nest also has kind of like a gambit of tools for building reusable pieces. So one is called interceptors, which are really neat and actually tie back to metaprogramming because they kind of fill a role of aspect-oriented programming where you can kind of modify behavior of existing functions in your application. So a really brief example of that is you can apply interceptors to your handlers that will basically run before and also give you the mechanism to receive the result of whatever the handler produced so that you can log it or mutate it or basically kind of deal with those cross-cutting concerns in a way that is really modular and reusable. So there's interceptors, which are kind of like, yeah, you want to do, like this is an example of a logging one. So this one would print before and after a handler ran and give you some timing information about how long it actually took for that function to run. There's built-in interceptors for caching. If you want to say, keep the result of an API call around for a minute and then validate the cache and then for regenerate whatever, that's all in there. They have built-in support for guards, which are kind of off-related cross-cutting concern, where if you want to have protection around who or under what conditions API endpoints can be accessed, you can incorporate those.
Is this how they're implementing updates
for the different HTTP verbs? So those are just decorators. If I go back to the app controller, I just have one here called get. If I wanted to do a post, actually, I'll just show you the one from the cats example because that exists in there already, the cats controller. So if you wanted to do a post where only certain user roles are allowed to perform that post, it's just a decorator that post.
So you don't have different definitions for update and what the different ones of like HTTP RESTful.
Yeah, it's just achieved through these decorators that are based on the HTTP verb. So like this one is handling post. If I wanted it to handle put, I could switch it to put. Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, but like, how is that implemented? Is it just a decorator, or is it actually?
No, it's implemented by your function that's being decorated. So like you can see here that this was post before. When a post request comes to the backend, it will be handled by this function called create, which will call a create method on some service.
I understand, but like all the post data is the same. Usually the framework is like separating the different types of posts into put, update, and like just regular post. And like depending on the type that it like signifies to that, then it redirects into different controllers. So like when you're routing the different types of activity, you kind of have to filter the input to find out what kind of post it was, to then pass it on to the correct like responder.
They told you about the create.
Yeah, I'm not sure what you mean by the different kinds of posts.
He's saying when people use posts, but then in the header have that it's actually patch, like that.
Oh, yeah, so you can have handlers that do patch or post or put. It just really depends on what decorator that you apply on top of the actual method handler. Inside of the implementation for that, you can have your service, you know, have the logic to differentiate that properly, and then you could just reuse the same service method across all of those handlers. But ultimately, it boils down to this being the thing that's actually creating the routing table underneath the hood for you. This decorator that you put on top of your controller handler.
I guess it's best. Can you have more than one?
Can you have more than one verb on top of it, like that?
No. Like let's say you have create, and then you have like create two different methods.
Oh, I see. Yeah. So the other thing that we haven't covered is that like you can put as many you can put a route template in this decorator, so I could have as many posts as I want in a controller, and then they're routed based on the path.
So like there are different behaviors that you want to be able to like apply to based on like the different use cases. The same code coming, for example, from different states. Like this is something that you can kind of do in React very easily. From different states, the same post can result in different like controllers responding to.
In different controllers altogether?
Like not necessarily controllers, different functions, methods.
Sure. Yeah. I think I see what you're saying. So again, kind of going back to the idea that Nest is pushing down this path of like your controller should be dumb and it should only be a routing mechanism. Inside of like whatever I do in this handler, I can have that kind of rich business logic that you're talking about.
So you can use an interceptor to be able to filter the traffic.
You could, yeah. Interceptors have access to the entire HTTP object. So if it made sense to kind of bake that into an interceptor, because it was a cross-cutting concern that you wanted to apply in a lot of different places, you could definitely use an interceptor to do something like that. Yeah. Yeah. So that's kind of most of it. I mean, there's some other cool stuff like on the microservices side of it. Where am I?
I see gRPC there.
Yeah.
So is that, did you try it?
I have not used gRPC in production yet. The microservices module is really neat in that it is transport agnostic. So it provides you a way to do like RPC, like request response, or PubSub using kind of an abstraction over top of the actual transport mechanism. So you can accomplish that using any of these different, well, Redis or MQTT or NATS or gRPC or RabbitMQ. Yeah. There's also stuff around like automatic generation of the Swagger specification that's driven by decorators, like rich object validation if you want to have like whether or not an object for a post meets a certain structure or whatever like that. So if you want to do model validation, it's all baked in. There's a ton of stuff in there, and it's a lot. It's too much to go over in one video talk, but would definitely recommend that you download the CLI, spin it up, or even just start with the sample application because there's 23 different scenarios in there that'll kind of cover the different stuff you want to try.
So you used TypeScript for a while, huh?
Yes.
Did you find your productivity better if you were using instead like ES6 or something with another editor or something?
Yeah. I'm biased because I started writing .NET. That's where I started writing statically typed languages, so I very much like TypeScript from that perspective. I think that just around like IntelliSense refactoring, it's definitely a productivity gain, at least from like my exposure to it. And also TypeScript, when you kind of get into some of the more advanced language features that they've brought out more recently, actually does some stuff that no other static language does because it is still JavaScript at its core. It allows it to do some really neat stuff around like structural typing that you can't do in a language like C#. So it's been a really awesome experience.
I think with transpiling you can target ES6, ES5,
Oh yeah.
3, whatever.
So in the TS config, you can put a target here. But one of the more interesting things that's happening in the ecosystem right now is TypeScript and Babel are converging, because Babel is a tool that does transpilation really, really well. And there's a lot of plugins and tooling that are built into it. So TypeScript actually has the intention of no longer taking care of transpilation. They're going to be a compiler only in the sense of like a type check compiler, and then they're going to have Babel plugins for actually doing the transpilation so that you can leverage the rest of the Babel ecosystem, which is much, much bigger and more broadly used.
Because they were at once, they were competing, yeah?
Yes,
Babel
yeah,
with TypeScript, yeah. So it's good that at least they recognize who is the leader and they leave the best guy to take care of the thing.
Yeah, and I think that shows the commitment that they have to the community as a whole. Instead of trying to pigeonhole people into one approach, they're kind of using the biggest and the best from across like a wide array.
Because people against TypeScript said, I can use ES6 and Babel, why I need TypeScript, yeah? But it's the advantage of the classes and what TypeScript provides, yeah.
You don't have a timeline where Babel is going to be established.
With TypeScript, you can already use it today. Yeah, it's not the default in like a NestJS project when you scaffold it, but I would imagine that it would make it that far in the near future. But yeah, you can use, if you want to do Babel as your transpiler for TypeScript, you can do that today.
Why would you even care to use ES5?
I don't know, if you had an environment that you were targeting that had a hard dependency on needing to run or be executed as ES5. I certainly, like the projects that I've been working on, have the advantage of being a bit more like greenfield or flexible on what they're targeting. So I usually will turn it up to like the most recent that I can kind of get away with.
So if you're using like legacy projects, 5, 6, 7 years old. Not IE5, like JavaScript applications that are a few years old.
Just wrap that into like the after.
Depends on the complexity.
Yeah. Cool. All right, that's basically the end. Thanks. Again, my GitHub is Wonder Panda. I made that when I was in school, and now I'm stuck with it. So. And I'm just going to do a quick shameless plug on 2 of my open source projects. One is a microservice architecture using Nest. So if you're interested in how you could build a microservice application using Nest, this has a whole bunch of stuff around what the setup for Docker would look like for that, as well as exposing some of the functionality through GraphQL. So if you're interested in that, you can check that out. And then the other library that I've been building is called NestJS Plus, which is basically a collection of modules that allow for, right now, the 2 primary ones are integrations with RabbitMQ. If you're using that as like a pub/sub mechanism or a bandbox or whatever, it gives rich integration with RabbitMQ. And then I've also built out a module for discovery, which you can use in a lot of different ways to build other modules. And it just gives you a flexible API for being able to query the metadata that exists inside of your Nest application. So if you want to like, discover all controllers that have a certain metadata attached to them, that's what that library does. And all of that's available on NPM, so you can check those out too. Give me a star. That'd be cool. All right. Any other questions?
How's the security?
So you can check out the authentication. There's a default module for integrating the passport, which is one of the de facto auth mechanisms, but overall, like the main takeaway is that the module system in Nest allows it to be really flexible in terms of plug and play. So if you have like Auth0 or you have a particular auth provider that you want to integrate with, it's not hard to build those modules, or the community might have already built one. So there's another repo called NestJS. So it's one of those like curated lists of a whole bunch of different community efforts around that. I would check to see if your auth provider of choice already has a module built for it.
So I'm assuming it's sort of inheriting the Express security, right? Because it's built upon Express.
Are you talking about like, sorry, when you say security, do you mean for like authorization and
I'm saying general security.
Like security from vulnerabilities or security?
Vulnerabilities, yeah.
Okay, then yeah, you're kind of bound by Express in that case.
And how historically it's been pretty solid.
I haven't heard of anything too major. I mean, there was a bit of a fiasco not that long ago with NPM where someone managed to sneak something nasty in there. It didn't directly affect Express or Nest to my knowledge, but that's something to always be keeping an eye out on. And in fact, like there's been some community effort, even in the newer versions of NPM, it'll automatically notify you if you have packages that have known vulnerabilities and help you develop like security audits around the community packages that you're pulling into your project. So, and there's all kinds of enterprise offerings around that too. Like I know there's a ton of companies that offer like security auditing if that's something that's really important to your business.
So can you talk about the scalability of this? Like, where's the scalability?
So scalability, I think, refers to like developer team scalability. Like it's as scalable as Node is in general, which I mean, it's not as fast as other compiled languages, but it's pretty damn scalable in terms of having a really amazing async story and a great event loop implementation, all that stuff. I think when they advertise scalability, they're advertising developer scalability in the terms that it's bringing structure to your application so that your developer team can scale.
I'm talking scalability and number of users, volumes of apps. Like,
so
your app suddenly gets hit by 50,000 users. Where's the scalability in this?
Sure.
Is there
I would reference the Tech and Power benchmarks as one place that you can keep an eye on that. I mean, that's kind of a contract question, just in the sense that there's a lot of tooling around to solve that problem separate from your actual language itself. Like, if you're using a cloud provider like App Engine, or if you're even using something agnostic like Kubernetes, dynamic auto-scaling is built into those tools. Like, it basically provisions new instances of your application on remote. So if you're interested in like the pure raw benchmarks of like how many users can one instance of the app running on these hardware requirements service, I'd reference
I
the
want
Tech
to know how
Power.
it's going to scale when you're in the cloud, right? And your demand goes up, and it's not going to run on one instance; it's going to run on multiple instances.
Do you have a particular cloud service that you use for that?
No, I don't. No, I'm asking.
Okay. Yeah, I mean,
like,
okay.
and particularly if you're using a database with your application, like, is there anything built in there to help the database scale, or is this like I just don't see the scalability? We haven't addressed scalability, other like you're saying that scalability within the organization.
Well, it's the same scalability argument you could make for any programming language. Like this isn't a question about Nest. I don't believe. You can run NestJS in Lambda if you wanted to, and that's infinite scalability. It'll just keep scaling as long as you have a credit card attached to it. You can have infinite users if that's really what you're after. So I think that the question really comes down to cost. Like how much money are you willing to spend for X number of users?
You can have infinite users with what?
Serverless, like AWS Lambda. Have you heard of that?
No, but what I've heard of it, but I'm really more interested in like what if you have databases, right?
Well, a database runs on certain hardware characteristics. Like, well, how big is your database? How many gigs of RAM do you have there?
Well, that's what I'm asking, right? Is you want to be, if you get big enough, a single database is, you can't just run it on one machine or one instance, right?
Sure, yeah. That's a whole thing that I feel like you do a whole meetup on. Like, there's vertical scaling, there's horizontal scaling, there's there's no SQL databases that have like infinite horizontal scaling as long as you pick a partition key that allows for compartmentalization of your data. That's like a whole other topic. And Nest works really well with any database, so I think that like it boils down to doing proper planning for your application, and it's important to kind of take a look at what are the expectations.
Okay, I was just wondering if there were some specific tools that came with it that with that type of scaling in mind.
Yeah, I would say that it's more of a problem about selecting the right database and the right application runtime. Like whether it's App Engine on Google, or if you're running in Kubernetes, or if you're running on App Service in Azure, like there's tons and tons of different options for kind of the environment that you want to run your apps in that address scalability specifically.
So you can put the access to database like a serverless function, yeah?
Pardon me?
You can put the access to the database like a serverless function.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that scales like very fast, yeah?
Yeah, like there is a community package for being able to run Nest applications on AWS Lambda. So if you want to use Lambda as your application hosting environment, then you do have infinite auto scale. Like it basically, as soon as it bumps up against like a bottleneck, it just provisions another instance, and it just keeps doing that, and then it reduces those as soon as the traffic goes away.
Okay, but I think what you are looking at, if you look at NestJS as a tool that can create microservices, right? Then those microservices can scale. You know, if you put them in containers, right? So you can write a microservice with NestJS, or any other Node.js, plain Node.js, things like that.
Right.
So it's the scaling is technology agnostic.
Yeah.
Basically. So Nest doesn't have to do anything to provide you scaling. What it provides is a better developer experience, faster development, and larger teams, and then it sits on top of Node.js to service the request, which is asynchronous. So whatever Node.js provides, NestJS can leverage.
There is, that's one of the differences that I noticed here, that this is in Laravel or Code Makers. When you get one of those set up, you're going to be running against MySQL.
Yep.
Like you look at different supported technology, it doesn't look like it's proprietary.
No, there are good packages. Like if you want to go down the SQL route, like they push really heavily a package called TypeORM, which is kind of like a SQL agnostic ORM. So it works with Postgres, it works with MySQL, it works with MariaDB. You can go down that path, and there's great examples in the samples directory that show how to do that.
But you can also do like message-based, because RabbitMQ is supported.
Yeah.
You can put Kafka, for screen-based, accelerate like crazy.
Well, and this seems like it'd be fairly lightweight. Like it looks like it's adding some convention on top of what you'd see in an Express application.
That's right.
Without too much more. Like you're basically just looking at Node versus whatever other language.
Yeah. And if you really want to get like into like which language is the fastest at serving plain text or database updates, this is a great tool to just deal with scalability at like an individual application instance. But I think, the big thing that I would say around scalability is just like there's tools that will take care of auto scaling regardless of what language you use. It doesn't matter if it's Nest or if it's Go or if it's Scala or Elixir or whatever. Like scaling is a problem that exists outside of the language or the framework.
Right now, the fastest framework is core.
Not yet. They're getting close. And it depends on what benchmark you look at. Like plain text is kind of contrived. Like that's how many times you can write hello world back without any other middleware. So that's like, it's not really real world. ASP.NET Core is number 7 right now. But they basically exhausted kind of like what the limitations of like a Ethernet cable is. Like if you look at the top, they're all floating around kind of like a theoretical limit that's based more on like how much data you can cram through the pipes that exist today and not like language. If you look at stuff like data updates, where there's a breakdown about what each of these benchmarks is actually doing. Data updates. This is like CRUD operations. So if you wanted to take a look at it from the perspective of CRUD operations instead, here's references and a really cool tool that you can use to kind of look that stuff up if you're interested.
You mentioned regarding scalability that being on top of Node.js, from the framework point of view, the limitations are given by Node.js. Yeah, there is no no overhead that Nest brings.
There's a very small overhead just to basically implement like the functional middleware that's there. I believe that was actually covered in. I forget where it is exactly, but he basically has had performance as far as like what the theoretical limitation of Node as a platform is at the forefront. So there's benchmarks that compare Express against Nest, and they're very, very close. There's a very minimal amount of overhead.
Yeah, another twist that what is showing is you can run this without Node.js. All you need is a JavaScript runtime, and you can use the battle-tested Java-based lightweight frameworks that are used by Java Microprofile, for example, like Undertow or Jetty or Tomcat or what have you, and add the JavaScript runtime on it. And the code that is compiled with this, you can just host it there. You just need a web service that can execute JavaScript. So there are huge amount of possibilities. With that setup, you get the advantages of multi-threading because Node.js is just single thread, asynchronous.
Yeah.
But with Java-based HTTP server, you get multi-threading, and on each thread you get asynchronous. So you can also scale that way in a single JVM runtime.
Awesome. Thanks, guys.
Thank you for making the trek out
Thank
from
you.
London, Jesse, and for speaking.
Yeah.
I think I know enough to not get confused between Next and Nest now. So.
Yeah, there's an unfortunate overlap with some naming there, for sure. I'm going to hang out for like a little bit longer, but I got to drive back to London, so if you have any other questions, feel free to grab me, but I'll probably do soon. So.
Yeah, I'm not sure when we're going to be locking up the doors, but we're going to hang out for a little while still tonight. In terms of next month, I don't think we have a strict plan yet, but is anybody else going to Vue.js next week?
Oh, yeah.
Yep.
Where's the Vue.js? Is there a Vue.js meetup?
Yeah, it's Tampa. No,
it's
that's the conference that is in Tampa next week, actually. So, a few of us are heading down, and that's probably a decent candidate for. Is anybody who's using Vue right now? Okay. Who's interested in doing a meetup on Vue? Okay. Okay. We can maybe mix it up with something else. I don't know. I know very little about Vue, but we got lots of people in the office that do, so we can probably rope somebody into it, and maybe we can throw it up on the meetup if anybody wants to do like a project share. If you've got anything that you've been working on, we can pull it up at the end maybe in like Q&A time. Other than that, I think just the same thing. If anyone's got any ideas, suggestions for next month or the month after, just throw it up on the meetup group, and we'll plan it from there. So.
You want to go to Hamilton tomorrow or dinner?
Yes. Am on tomorrow night at what time?
7.
And what location?
Commotion on me. It's downtown. Or
Bye.
that's good, but
Find more information on meetup, just go to Cam on
Yeah, KWJS is easier.
yeah, Cam on is just like the official hashtag. Right?
There you go. So yeah, again, we're gonna keep the doors open for a little while still. Feel free to hang out. I think there's maybe one. Are we done? We might be done. There's more drinks. Yeah, thanks everyone for coming.